Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. It might be afternoon, it might be evening. Welcome to this brand new series for the next 4 days. We're gonna be live with you, doing a climate justice series, and I'm so happy to be on with you. It's not my usual time, but I'm happy to be here with you guys, and I hope that you're happy to have me on. I want to encourage you wherever you're locked in. Let us know. Let us know where you're tuned in from, what country you're located in, and so that we can interact with you. So, as we know, those of you who follow us in the Caribbean, climate migration is a reality for the Caribbean, and we are actually on the front line. The impacts of climate change, as we all know, disasters and environmental degradation are increasingly causing a sudden displacement of individuals and entire communities, especially among our vulnerable populations. There is actually an imbalance in the way that climate justice has been affecting small island developing states who have contributed least but are impacted the most by the changing climate. I'd like to introduce you and welcome you again to Conversations on Migration in the Caribbean. And this is the Climate Justice Series. And those of you are viewing on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, good day to you. I'm your host, JL Joseph, and I'd like to introduce my co host. Joining me is Helen Glenison. Good morning to you, Helen.
Hey everyone,
How are you?
good, and you?
Great. I'm doing well, thank you. And you're gonna do some introductions for us, right, Helen?
Yes, thank you very much, Jael, for hosting this series on climate justice as part of the IOM's conversation on migration in the Caribbean. It is a pleasure to be here with you for this opening show of a series of four happening this week, as you mentioned, to further discuss critical issues together around human mobility and climate justice, with Caribbean youth leaders and climate activists as a strong power for change now and in the future. Today, we will have the chance to have with us three of them: Dainaline Swabi, who is a creator of Global Yadi podcast and a climate advocate from Jamaica. Then Joel Simpson, who is a human rights activist and founder and managing director of SASOT Guyana. You may already have seen and heard him on the fourth conversation on migration in the Caribbean, which happened in Suriname earlier this year. And finally, last but not least, Heidi Badenoch is a lawyer and activist from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So thank you very much to all of you for being here and accepting to join us for this very important discussion. So now giving you back the floor, Jael, for starting the discussion on how do human mobility and climate justice intersect, particularly in the context of the Caribbean's unique vulnerabilities ahead of COP29 happening next month in Azerbaijan. Back.
Thank you very much, Helen, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you to our guests who are joining us. Welcome. Hope you guys are having a good day wherever you're locked in. As we know, marginalized communities and vulnerable populations are often the most impacted by intense storms. We have flooding, we have drought, sea surge, extreme temperatures, and even other impacts. They are often trapped in areas especially vulnerable to the impact of climate change, or they want to stay in their land, but they need solutions to adapt and thrive despite all of the impacts of climate change. As we speak, we know that farmers in the southwest parishes of Jamaica, including many farmers who are women, are actually struggling to regain their homes and their livelihood after the impacts of Hurricane Beryl. I'd like to pose this question to you, Dana Lynn. How can climate justice help marginalized communities to move away from high risk areas or even to adapt and thrive in Caribbean SIDS highly exposed to climate change? Sorry, you're on mute.
Can't believe I felt trapped to the most common blunder there. But thank you so much, Joel, for Jael, for bringing me into the conversation with that critical question. Before I jump right into it, I do have to share a connected personal experience. in 2019, while I was doing my master's in London, I remember attending a lecture on climate change and migration. And I recognized in the lecture that there was absolutely no focus or emphasis on the Caribbean, on Caribbean states. And so in my contribution in raising my hand, I asked about the Caribbean given our vulnerabilities. And in a most dismissive way, I was told that the Caribbean is fine because we have the mountains. This is 2 years after Hurricane Maria that would have devastated Dominic and other small island countries. And I recognized from and I was exposed by virtue of my connections to people from Dominica that some young people had to migrate to attend schools in other Caribbean countries and overseas. That's just one example of the plethora of vulnerabilities that we face. And I raise that point because in the conversation around climate justice, in the conversation around small island developing states like Jamaica, the rest of the Caribbean being on the front lines, we still have the notion that we are not as badly affected as places in other parts of the world. And I'm not sure, why it is that with the prolificacy of the news headlines, the obvious impacts, even the rise of social media showcasing the prevalence of what we have to go through, people feel as if we're okay. So while the climate impacts have us in the Caribbean exercising the resilience muscle, this really underscores the critical nature of a conversation like this. And coming back to your original question about how climate justice can play a role, it's very fitting that we're looking through the lens of climate justice when we're looking at the intersection of human mobility and climate-induced migration, because climate justice is centering people, centering human rights in our response to adaptation. We can't adapt to climate change if we're leaving people behind. So it's a conversation that highlights the exacerbation of vulnerabilities. And I love that you actually gave the option of either we're moving away from high risk areas or how we can adapt. Because the reality, like in Jamaica, there is a difficulty in getting people to move away from vulnerable spaces. So a workaround to this is not just it's ensuring that if it is that people are migrating, how are they doing this in a safe way, in a way that preserves their dignity? And so I think boosting the adaptive capacity of communities is something that has to play front and center. Before that, we're addressing the equitable distribution of resources, because oftentimes vulnerable communities have pre-existing vulnerabilities. So it's not just geographic because of their location and if they're prone to flooding, landslides, and other climate extremes or disasters. It's also the fact that they're under-resourced to even build their adaptive capacity. How is it that we're investing in the climate resilience or climate adaptive technologies? We also have to bring into the conversation the gender dimensions of climate impacts. Women, female-headed households, and young girls who are disproportionately impacted by climate change is also something that we have to bring into the conversation. I'm from St. Elizabeth, one of the hardest hit areas in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl. And so I acknowledge that a lot of relief and recovery efforts have also prioritized, focus on, supporting females who have natural resource-based livelihoods, and not just females, the small farmers and the fisher folk. Over 48,000 farmers were affected, 11,000 fisher folk affected in given the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl. And so a lot of the help, and I'm also pleased that I'm a part of, whether it be small-scale efforts, but no effort is too small, being a part of efforts, not just providing relief, but also focusing on livelihoods. So just recently distributing support so that female poultry farmers could resume their operations. So in the event that there is limited options to relocate, we have to ensure that there are resources to rebuild. And also, if it is 100% necessary to relocate, it means that we also have to invite participatory approaches when we look at relocation strategies, because place-based attachment is very real. We've seen it time and time again. Parish disaster communities, the local and national authorities in Jamaica and other countries, there is a challenge in actually getting people to move because of the attachment, and rightly so, to their livelihoods, to their property and so forth. And there are other security issues and other issues that we have to contend with. So it's not very easy to say your life is at stake, your safety is at stake. People think about, where am I going to go? How do I eat? Am I able to reintegrate? Not just from a point of having somewhere safe to sleep, but how is it that I will be able to resume my livelihood operations? And so adaptive capacity not only looks at the climate resilient technologies, whether it's water harvesting or other climate smart agriculture techniques and equipment that we'll have to provide to people who are vulnerable. But how is it that, if in the event that they're migrating, some persons who are not necessarily connected to those livelihood sectors, how is it that we're looking at building capacity and also equipping people with skills, so that if they're going to another country, if they're going to another location, they don't feel like a burden. So it's not, so we also in the conversation around climate induced migration have to ensure that people don't feel like they're refugees but contributees. I was just trying to rhyme, but it's really contributors. So they're contributors in the new spaces that they occupy. And there's a whole other issues and considerations around social protection mechanisms, again, that will help people to bounce back faster, so that they're not worse off in the event, of a natural disaster. We also have to have a conversation around issues around cultural integration, cultural loss, and cultural identity for people who don't have the option of rebuilding where they are. But if it means migrating to another community within their country, or cross-border migration, how is it that there is strategies or considerations that allow them to retain aspects of their culture, aspects of their identity? And so I know there's a lot.
Such a wholesome response. Like, I feel you touched on every single piece, and thank you very much for
getting everything.
And you spread it so passionately as well. So, I mean, for those of us who understand exactly what the impact meant, I was expecting during Hurricane Maria. I got caught in Hurricane Maria as a pregnant 6 months pregnant woman. All right. So I'll leave that there, because you shared so much, and we want to continue the conversation. And I know we'll circle back around if folks have questions. I know Helen is shaking her head because she's getting some gems, and we'll circle back to you because we want to touch on some of the things that you mentioned. I want to bring the conversation across to Joel. And Joel, you've argued that migration should not be just merely is not merely just a challenge, but as a legitimate adaptation strategy for those facing the brunt of climate impacts. You have also emphasized the need for legal frameworks that protect the rights of climate migrants, ensuring that they have access to resources, support systems that facilitate their integration as well as their resilience. How do you propose that small Caribbean economies can address the immediate needs of displaced population and also build long-term resilience against future climate events?
Thanks, Jael. Thanks for having me. And, oftentimes these conversations are centered around the small island experience. And of course, Guyana, as a mainland territory in the Caribbean, is not an island. So we also have our own challenges in relation to the climate crisis. Our own capital city, Georgetown, is slated to be underwater by 2030. So it's a very real issue, even outside of small island places. I think there are a couple of key things that small economies can do that don't cost much. They just call for the will to do it, the political will. And those things are, one, we need to collect data on these issues. And this is very important, because if you don't have the data and you always relying completely on anecdotal evidence, you'll never understand the scope of the problem. In the sector that I particularly work in, particularly in relation to sexual and gender minorities, most states in the English-speaking Caribbean don't collect data about our populations at all. And for me, it could start as very simply as inclusion in something like the census, where we can ask questions about sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on, so that we know who people are and where we are. And we have that kind of basic data. I think that's very important, because we have a lot of anecdotal evidence about displacement of marginalized populations, but we often can't quantify the problem. The second and very important thing that I think needs to happen in the trajectory to get towards legislative action is policies, state policies which give guidance on this issue. And I think this is very important. First, states need to formulate the policies that their actions in relation to the climate crisis are non-discriminatory. And like my colleague from Jamaica, I have a personal experience with this that I want to share. I recall when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a health crisis, and our government was distributing aid for in relation to COVID-19. And then we got as well flooding, which compounded the situation during COVID in Guyana. And as aid workers were distributing relief, particularly in rural communities in Berbice of Guyana, aid workers decided to exclude transgender people in those communities who were standing on the roadside waiting to collect their hampers and so on, like everybody else. No, there's no government policy that dictated that exclusion. But there's also no government policy that says everybody must be included and you can't leave anybody out. So this is where policy becomes very important so that you can hold people accountable to a written standard. And in the Caribbean, these standards just don't exist. Now, discrimination of this nature often happens in practice, and this is where sensitization and training becomes important. There are conversations already happening in the region, and I think all we need to do is to be inclusive and intersectional in our approach about these conversations. So when we're talking about marginalized and vulnerable populations, include everybody. Sexual and gender minorities also need to be part of the conversation. It needs to be part of the sensitization and training for everybody working in migration, in climate action, so that no one is excluded and no one is left behind.
Thank you very much, Joel, for this such a comprehensive approach. And I want to continue on with Heidi. I want to bring in Heidi into the conversation. And Heidi, you come from the Union Island, right, which is part of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines, with a population of over less than 4,000 people, I believe. And Hurricane Beryl really hit your island back on July the 1st this year. And more than 95% of the buildings on Union Island were affected in some ways, and 73% were in the category of destroyed or damaged. 85% of people surveyed in emergency shelters did not have access to income-generating activities. What does this kind of impact mean for the state? And what are some of the non-economic impacts arising from the impact of Hurricane Beryl on your island?
Thanks, Jael. It's such an honor to be here among such versed individuals. The youth, we have a promising future if we keep this up. The last report I saw coming from the IMF preliminarily said that between 20 to 25% of the GDP of St. Vincent and the Grenadines was affected by Hurricane Beryl. It may seem small, but putting it into context, that's a quarter of the country's GDP affected in a one-off incident. The government has said that 800 million Eastern Caribbean dollars in damage occurred in that one-off event, right? This shows that for such small islands, we can easily have our resources affected. And because even though Union Island is one of 32 islands, Union Island plays such an important role in the overall economy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Union Island, Mairo, Canoan, these islands, they have inhabited by locals, and they were greatly affected by Hurricane Beryl. We also have Petit St. Vincent, Palm Island, which are resort islands, which contribute significantly to the GDP of the country. They've been wiped out completely. They're now in the rebuilding process. Union Island mainly, it's a tourism-based island. So without buildings, no infrastructure, no electricity, no internet, water, limited. It is very difficult to see how persons can or will want to visit Union Island and have them contributing to the recovery of the economy of that island. Otherwise, persons are fisher folk. They run small businesses, market shops, that sort of thing. So the revenue greatly impacted. The recovery unknown at this time, what they would have to do to get back to where they need to be. This is a long-term effort. I am unsure of what recovery would look like. We're now starting to see some return to electricity. I mean, basic needs like this. We're 3 months down the road, we're now getting back electricity in the context of street lights. That tells you the sort of impact these disasters can have. Outside of the economic impact, we see that persons were forced to migrate, the youth, the elderly, families have been broken apart. And coming from that forced migration, we now would have a loss of culture. Small communities like United Island, big on culture, very close knit. But when we see the separation, moving families from one island to another, displacement of students, we know that the culture, what makes them inherently unionites, that's what we call ourselves, what makes us inherently unionites, it will be lost over time, especially where recovery efforts are so far down the road. We don't know if persons after such a traumatic experience will want to return to the island, and we don't know how long it would take for them to return to the island. Just this morning, I noticed somebody speaking about the psychological impact of such a disaster on the elderly. My parents, for example, my father, following Beryl was the first time I saw him cry, a 76-year-old man crying after such a disaster. And it is hard, particularly when you have these islands, people who work their entire lives. This is what they know. This is their home. They know nothing else. This is where they've invested all of their resources. When you reach that age, and Union Island does have an aging population, again, because it's so small, that's something that we hear occurring in small communities. When you have such an aging population and the impact is so heavy on them, you now have to think about having psychosocial support for them. Um, it's really heartbreaking because we often see on TV, we hear, but to experience what it is to go through one of these disasters, it's it's really something else. And I know, back in 2004, I think with Ivan, we thought, oh, this is a one-off thing. But as we can see, it's becoming more and more prevalent. Back when Ivan happened, I remember students leaving Grenada, coming to St. Vincent to go to school. That's a broken family. That's a loss of culture. That's displacement. Now we see it happening in Dominica. We see it happening in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's becoming more and more of our new normal. And unfortunately, our new normal places us in a position where we are unable to cope because we lack the resources to cope. And I'm going to leave it there, Jail.
Wow, this was very heavy, Heidi. I felt like I was relieving every single thing that you said, and I heard it in your voice. I heard, how heartbreaking it was even for your dad, and it's so personal, and it's our personal. Every single person in the Caribbean has a personal story, and I want to bring in Helen because Helen, we're working hard towards COP 29, and we see these events happen every single year, and I want to bring you into the fold because I know you have questions for our panelists here today. Sorry, Helen, you're on mute. You're muted.
Yes, sorry. Thank you very much, Jael, for this. Thank you very much, Heidi, Joel, and then Eileen for sharing your personal experience and knowledge. And actually, it's about generation, you know. It's about your parents, your grandparents, you and even your children and grandchildren, hopefully. So it's not just now. It's something that will impact you in the future. I don't know if we have time, Jael, for the second question. Yes, okay. So we will go directly to the second question. I wanted to have a brief summary, but I think we will just go to the second question. So just because I think now with all what you mentioned is important to kind of and ask you an actionable question for COP29. As next month, global leaders will be meeting again in Azerbaijan, in Baku. So, what would be your message you want to send to world leaders about achieving climate justice for and in the Caribbean? So, over to you. I give you the floor, Joel, Heidi, and Diana Lynn. Thank you very much.
Who wants to go? Joel, you want to go or?
Sure. I think I would very simply say be inclusive, leave no one behind. This is an issue that affects everybody. But at the same time, those who are already facing disadvantage, marginalization, socially, economically, culturally, will feel the brunt of the climate crisis more than anyone else. So we have to be deliberately inclusive. We have to reach out and engage minority groups. We have to document people's issues. We have to include them in the data so that we can design policies which in turn benefit those who will be at the brunt of the climate crisis and will feel the effects of the climate crisis. So that would be my simple message for world leaders.
Thank you, Joel. How about you, Dana Lee?
I would say it's time to really prioritize the most vulnerable, and the Caribbean cannot adapt fast enough if the global leaders, especially the global north, doesn't act fast enough in curbing the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And for me, going to COP29, what we want to hear is how that loss and damage fund will be operationalized. And so it's really a priority for the Caribbean and other small island developing countries to receive adaptation funds. And in the dissemination or distribution of those funds, it has to be a prioritization of grant-based rather than loan-based applications, because we are under-resourced and there is a disparity as it relates to the responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, and we bear the brunt of that burden. And so we have to be supported in strengthening our adaptive capacity and responding, and so that we don't have the need to be migrating populations, because when it comes to loss and damage, the irreversible impacts and the losses, that fits squarely into how we are being affected here in the Caribbean.
Thank you, Danilyn. And Heidi?
The price we pay for the development of larger countries, it's too high. We see that price in the displacement of our people and in the loss of our culture. And we as indigenous and descendants of enslaved people know that price all too well. We're tired of having to liken ourselves to Lazarus of the Old Testament, where we have to beg at the rich man's table every time disaster strikes. We are tired of the platitudes and the thoughts and prayers that without meaningful action, it's not worth the energy taken to say them. It's time to shift the burden, because we, as small island developing states, we need help. We don't contribute that much to what is affecting us the most, and it is time that the larger countries start taking action.
Wow, Helen, back to you.
I think these were the last words, and they were amazing. So thank you very much for all your contributions, for speaking so freely about your realities, about what the Caribbean is living for the moment, but will be living in the future as well. Unfortunately, because environmental disasters are being more frequent and intense. So we need to take that into account when speaking about the Caribbean, when speaking about the adverse impacts of climate change, and when speaking about people that are affected by climate change, by environmental disasters, by environmental degradation, and even more when they are marginalized and vulnerable. So I think we had an amazing discussion today. I will give you the floor, Jael, for the final words for the next ones that are coming in the next days. And thank you again. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much to you, Helen, and thank you to the IOM Caribbean for putting on such an important series, Climate Justice. I want to say thank you very much to the participants, the panelists. You guys came with such a wealth of knowledge, but not just the knowledge, the passion behind the work that you do. And in terms of transmitting, like I felt every single one of your contributions, like I felt it, right? I was trying to keep it together. I know a lot of people on the live, we're also trying to keep it together. And I want to say thanks to you, Dana Lynn, and thanks to you, Joelle, and thanks to you, Heidi, for joining us here today. And thanks again to you, Helen, for being such a wonderful co-host. We'll be back tomorrow because we continue the fight. Climate Justice Series. We'll have 2 new guests coming on. They'll be joining us. So we want to encourage you guys to go ahead and follow the IOM Caribbean pages, follow on YouTube, follow on Facebook, and stay connected so that we can give the information and we can actually have something ready for COP29. We're coming ready, right? We're coming ready. Thanks again, all of you who tuned in, and we'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.